Dr. Paul Miller, thank you so much for joining us on A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
Randy and Kyle, thank you so much. It's good to meet you both, and thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, we're excited. The book is The Religion of American Greatness. It's a really heavy book. It's serious. It's a little bit academic, but it is very approachable. So don't, listeners, you might get scared off by that word academic. Don't get scared off. It's very approachable. Similar to Jesus and John Wayne, I just told Kyle, I think in some ways, except from a very decidedly conservative perspective, which we're excited to talk to you in particular, coming from that the right side of the aisle, I guess. So yeah. Kyle, you want to get right after it?
Yeah, I really appreciate the book, Paul. And I want to say whoever did the cover art is brilliant.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I don't know if you had anything to do with that, but it's really...
I didn't. I agree. I love the cover art, and I had nothing to do with it. So kudos to the IVP artist.
Nice. So yeah, we probably still our most listened to episode in the history of our podcast has been one on politics and nationalism and patriotism and why we're generally not fans of any of those things. And we've thought for a while we need to have some kind of more conservative voice on the podcast than we are, especially than I am, to kind of balance us out. And so when I heard about your book, I thought this seems like a really good guest to have. And for listeners who don't know, this is somebody who like worked in the Bush administration. So you're like a serious bona fides, conservative, and also wrote this really strong argument against Christian nationalism, particularly on the conservative side of the political aisle. So we've got some kind of heady questions, some deep questions for you, but we also like to keep it light and cordial and civil and everything. So let's just see where the conversation takes us. Before we get started, I just want to say, and I wrote this down because I thought carefully about how I wanted to say it, because I don't want to exaggerate in either direction. So your book in many places frustrated me, frankly, and in a couple places actually disturbed me. And there's a lot of critique that I would love to make of it. But I'm going to pay you about the highest compliment I can think to pay anyone being a philosopher, and that is that I would like to make the critique and I would like to have the conversation with you, because in my experience, the only conversations worth having are those where there's serious disagreement involved and honest dialogue. And so I'm not at all conservative. I'm no friend of any kind of conservatism that you would probably recognize as conservatism. But I think you're someone that I can recognize as a worthy dialogue partner, and you have ideals that I can appreciate, even if I disagree with them. And even if I think you don't always hold to them consistently, I can appreciate them. And we're going to talk about some of those ideals in just a minute, if that's okay. So I guess thanks for being so sober-minded in this book and writing it as carefully as you did.
Hey, I actually say something kind of similar to my students at the beginning of the semester about the value of disagreement and dialogue and the importance of, being willing to have the conversation with the things you disagree with. And it is a way of paying respect to people to have that conversation, to say, hey, look, I think I disagree with you. I think you're wrong, and here's why. Yeah. And if we can't do that, then, democracy is doomed and we should all go home. So I appreciate you saying what you said. I hope that we can come to, both of us, greater clarity and wisdom through this conversation. And look, I've been talking about my book too much and too long. I don't know that I got it all right. And so I look forward to your pushback, and maybe we can learn from each other.
Awesome.
That is fantastic.
Yeah, love it. Okay, so you're a self-described conservative Christian patriot. So to start out, can you maybe just tell us briefly what you mean by each of those terms? Conservative Christian patriot.
Yeah, I mean conservative in the pre-2016 sense, in the sense that kind of, I guess maybe Russell Kirk and the whole conservative movement from 1955 to 2016 meant the word. Limited government, conservatism, smaller government, localism, that kind of stuff. I have an instinctive appreciation for that way of thinking about politics. Augustine has this great line where he says, if everything was perfectly just, kingdoms would be small, and there would be as many kingdoms as there are houses in a city. I'm intuitively drawn to that. This idea that if we're doing it right, we got to allow 1,000 flowers to bloom. And so that's sort of my conservative instinct. What am I meant by Christian? Right now I attend a Southern Baptist church. I affirm the Nicene Creed. I affirm the Apostles' Creed. I affirm the Second London Baptist Creed and the 1833 New Hampshire Creed and my local church's statement of faith. I believe in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and he's the only way to salvation, and I'm deeply grateful for all that he's done in my life. Patriot, I'm an American, and I'm grateful for this country. And I think that it's actually my responsibility as an American to work to leave it a little bit better than I found it. When God made Adam, put him in the garden, Genesis 2:15, what did he say? He said, tend and keep the garden. I kind of think of patriotism that way. Each of us have been born into one particular plot of the garden, one country plot. And so we're to tend and keep it and love it and be grateful for it. And that's kind of all I mean by patriotism, and nothing more than that. So I want to be faithful to tend and keep this particular plot that I happen to call home. And I like it. I'm grateful for it. And I hope I leave it better.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. So how is patriotism then different from nationalism, and why are you, in favor of patriotism, but so critical of nationalism?
So a lot of folks use the terms interchangeably. I understand it can be confusing because of the word nation. If you say, I love my nation, that sounds like nationalism. Mm-hmm. But if you really kind of push, the folks who are advocating nationalism, they do tend to mean more than just love of country. Mm-hmm. Right. It's actually an argument about how to define the country. I can be a patriot and actually not get too wrapped up around what the definition of my country is or what its culture is. Hey, this is the country I'm born into. Love it. Nationalism is an argument about political identity. It's a political agenda for defining your country a certain way. American nationalism says our country is this kind of country and not another kind. Specifically, American nationalism always says it's a Christian country or a Judeo-Christian country, and we have to use the government to keep it that way. That's really the hardcore of nationalism, is the belief that the government has a role to keep it that way. It's a political agenda, not just a passive stance of gratitude and appreciation for your country. As a conservative, I'm a little bit wary about giving the government that kind of power to tell us who we are, giving the government authority, jurisdiction, coercive powers over our cultural identity. I love the idea, rather, of free culture. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, and I don't want the government, in the business of saying you're an American and therefore you should cultivate this particular cultural identity.
Yeah. Any follow-ups to that before I move to the next thing?
No, go ahead.
Okay, let me ask you about one specific thing you say in the book about patriotism still before we leave that topic. So you quote Edmund Burke, who I've been realizing in the last few years is like the favorite thinker of lots of thoughtful conservatives. And so you quote him saying that local public affections are ultimately supposed to be, this is his quote, the first link in the series by which we proceed towards a love to our country and to mankind. That and to mankind really struck me. And so you expand on that. You say, Burke thought the little platoons were important because they helped train our hearts to be other directed, and because we should not ultimately be concerned only with the other members of our tribe. We should in principle love every human being in the world. Loving the strangers whom we call countrymen helps us practice that kind of universal, disinterested love of humanity. That's your quote. So I admit that's a really beautiful vision of patriotism, and I wish I'd ever seen it instantiated. So we had a theologian named Samir Yadav on the program a while back, and he made the point, and this is not unique to him, but he made the point that one of the truth conditions of Christianity is that a certain kind of community is possible, and really that it's actually instantiated, because if it's not, it gives critics a really good reason to think that Christianity isn't true. And I think that something similar could probably be said of the kind of Burkean patriotism you're describing there. And so I want to put the question to you. It seems like the sort of impulse that he describes from love of platoon to love of humankind should be on display somewhere. And I imagine you probably think it is, and maybe you can point me to a bunch of places just off the top of your head. So if it is, where is it? Where are all the communities being ignited to universal love of humanity by believing that America is the best country in the world?
Yeah, no, that's a challenging and a fair question. I don't assume that we've gotten this right in America. I don't know that I could point to examples of American patriotism and say, yeah, this is the right way of doing it in training us for the broader love of mankind that I think we should have. I mean, I try to practice it in my own home, but I don't know that on a large scale it's there. If there are small communities that are succeeding in training hearts for the next layer out, I think we might see it in local churches, right? If the church is not doing it, then they're doing a real bad job, right? Turning our hearts to be other directed. You might also see it in schools. When you take children from the family and put them in a school, you are socializing them to affiliate with other people who are not immediate family members, and yet to have an attachment to them and prepare them for the next step of moving out into the world. That might be a example of that kind of heart training that I'm talking about in that passage. Again, look, we got a lot of problems with our schools, but I would maybe idealistically say that's where we might see some examples of success. But what do you think?
Oh, I don't think there are any, but but I love that answer. No, this is one of the things that I disagree with. I don't think that kind of patriotism actually exists. But I will take your point there and say maybe I should look on more local context.
So pastorally, I just have a couple questions for you, Paul, about the patriotism in the first chapter 2, I think around page 26 or 27, you really kind of make this case for why it's really helpful and most loving to be a patriotic person in some ways. And you kind of say in that same section that we shouldn't reject group loyalty or patriotism, because if we do, we'll just move to following another group, because we can't live without some sort of group identity. Now, when you talk about group identity, pastorally, I kind of feel like Christians should identify themselves as followers of Christ or members of the kingdom of God and have really, if I'm being honest, no other allegiance. Isn't that enough group loyalty or group identity? Why is it important to add being a patriot to our identity as Christ followers? And I say that as someone who I would say I have patriotic tendencies. Kyle would not, but I would say I have patriotic tendencies. My mom is an immigrant, and I get chills, when I see the Statue of Liberty, and I love certain things that the founding fathers did and said and wrote and established. I think it's why we're still a mostly whole nation after a Trump presidency. The list goes on and on.
And you're willing to say that America is the greatest country in the world, right?
100%.
Yeah.
But patriotism scares me pastorally, because I think patriotism really quickly turns into idolatry. And I say that while meaning that most people that I know who I love, who really love this country, and by love this country, I mean they would consider themselves patriots. A lot of times their allegiance, their faithfulness, their worship, their dedication seems like it centers first and foremost on America and second on Christ and his kingdom. And that's where I have a lot of problems with patriotism. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a reason why when I talk about patriotism, I root it fundamentally in gratitude, not in pride.
Okay.
A lot of people say, I'm proud to be an American. Well, look, I didn't choose. It was an accident, right? Or to me, it was an accident. It was in God's providence that I was born as an American. But it seems weird to take pride in that when it was not something I chose or had control over. I am grateful for being an American, because I think it's a great country, and I recognize the ways in which it's been great. And if you root patriotism in gratitude and humility, I think it does act as a safeguard against the idolatry you rightly identify as a temptation. And in my book, I'm sure you saw, I warn quite a lot against the idolatry, I say, of nationalism, but it's obviously a potential that we could become overly attached to our group loyalty, our country's group loyalty, that it becomes idolatrous. And that is absolutely something to warn against. Now, you said, as Christians, we should have loyalty to Jesus, to King Jesus. And I think you said, and nothing else, like there should be no other loyalties. I think I might disagree with that. I think our nested identities are all simply there. They're kind of natural. And this would be my Augustinian instinct here, that these group loyalties, these group identities are just, insofar as they're natural, they can be good if they are rightly ordered. Right? I'm a member of my family, and I'm loyal to my family, and I'm a member of my church and of my state and my, so forth and so on. And we all have those affiliations, and it's not bad to enjoy them. I don't think it's bad to have to feel a sense of membership in them, so long as they're rightly ordered, and we worship King Jesus first, and we are loyal to our family as probably number 2, and then on down the line. So that would be my response there on group loyalties. I don't think that they're intrinsically suspect.
Yeah, and I would say I think there's a difference between loyalty and allegiance, and I'm okay with saying yes. I have loyalties to my family, to my friend group, and my neighbors, whatever. Allegiance is such a strong word. Like for instance, after reading the book of Revelation and seeing God's call from allegiance to empire back to allegiance to the Lamb of God, who was violently murdered by the empire, I went to a Boy Scout meeting that my son went to, and with all the other dads, the flag comes out and we put our hands over our hearts. And I was like, I don't think I can pledge allegiance to the flag anymore because my allegiance belongs to Jesus and to Christ alone. What are your thoughts on that?
The Book of Revelation is a strong challenge to, as you say, to empire, to unjust, tyrannical political authority. And I think it's actually very telling that when John is painting a picture of satanic power, the image he chooses is a totalitarian government, right? That kind of tells us something about how bad evil government can be. But then there's another picture of government in Scripture. Think about King David on his deathbed. He says, a righteous king dawns on his people like the more, I don't remember the exact quote. He gives this image of dawning on the people and providing growth when he rules in righteousness. It is like dew at morning time or something like that. Righteous rule is a great blessing, and God desires all nations to govern justly. And insofar as they do that, they are reflecting the will of God. And I think that we can recognize and even give honor to governments that try to do that. The Apostle Peter says, fear God, honor the king, not just passively obey or tolerate, but actually honor the king. And he said that of the Roman government, interestingly. Mm-hmm. When I look at the American flag, I choose to interpret that as a symbol of all the best things we aspire to. And so I'm happy to pledge allegiance, pledge loyalty. I'm happy to recite the pledge to that symbol and to those ideals. If I had been thinking carefully and alive 100 years ago, I might have had a harder time with it because of what our country was doing at the time. But in God's providence, we do better each generation at living out those ideals. And I think we can recognize that, give honor to our country for those ideals, and be grateful to God for it. And that's how I think through that.
Yeah, that's a good segue to the next question.
I think it is, but let me ask one really quick follow-up. You said that our loyalty should be rightly ordered, and that's a phrase that pops up a lot in your book, rightly ordered. I'm curious what your method is for determining when something is rightly ordered.
Have me back in about 5 years when I write the third book in this series.
Nice. That's acceptable.
It's a good question, and remind me of that as I write the third book.
Yeah.
It's the decision principle of ordering. I don't know that I have a clear answer on that yet, but it is something on my mind.
So maybe we should let you say what the plans for the next couple of books are, because we didn't mention that.
Yeah. So this first book is facing rightward, and book number 2 faces leftward. And I look at what I think maybe the problems with the progressive left and the ways that it also exhibits some illiberalism. And then the third book is what I hope will be a kind of a vindication and defense of, ordered liberty from a Christian framework or an Augustinian framework, the return of the king, so to speak.
Yeah. So before we go any further, Paul, let's just ask for a quick couple of definitions. You talk about liberalism and illiberalism a lot in your book. I'm assuming those words are going to come up in the interview. Can you tell us what you mean by those words?
Yeah. So I'm really just using the word classical liberalism kind of as a shorthand for the open society, or maybe the philosophy of the American founders. Some people call it civic republicanism. I'm deliberately not being that precise with the definition. I just kind of mean it as a shorthand for the system of open government or free government that we like and that we sort of inherited, that I think is now endangered. Illiberal just means like all the stuff that is threatening that. It is ideas and institutions that tend towards undermining our experiment in free government. And I do think that both nationalism and progressivism have the seeds of illiberalism in them, if brought to full flower, could really do some harm to our system of government.
Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, so let's talk about ideals. I mentioned that earlier. So you say fairly early in the book, I think it's page 28 here, defining our national identity by a set of ideals helps guard against bad tribalism because it sets up an external standard outside and above the nation by which we can judge our nation's conduct. This enables the best kind of love for our country when we challenge ourselves to do better. So I like that. That sounds nice. So I'm curious what those ideals are and where you're getting them from, and then connected to that, who gets to say what they are.
Yeah, I usually say the Constitution and the Declaration as a kind of shorthand encapsulating the ideals and maybe the philosophy that informed them. Who gets to say? Well, it was, we the people, and it was the United States Congress representing the people that enacted those documents. And that's what literally founded the nation, and that's what continues to define who we are and who we aren't. That's what the whole book is about. It's about American identity. Nationalists want to say that we are defined by a culture, a specific Christian or Judeo-Christian culture. And if you don't share that culture, you're not a real American. And I think that's quite wrong. I think that America has quite a lot of cultures and subcultures within it, and they're all equally American so long as we all agree to the Constitution and the Declaration. The people who were most un-American were those who deliberately rejected those ideals. We call them Confederates. They waged war on the United States for a different set of ideals. And so I think it's easy to say this is the decision principle. This is the demarcation point. This is the thing that differentiates Americans from not Americans. It's the Constitution and it's the Declaration.
Yeah. So do you think that the ideals enshrined in the Constitution and those other documents, and maybe in the philosophy of people like John Locke or whoever that preceded those, do you think those ideals are admit of multiple interpretations?
Yes. And American history is the story of the argument of those rival interpretations.
Right.
And we also have a system for peacefully adjudicating that conversation. And that is kind of the most important point. Peaceful adjudication of those differences. Constitution is not a self-interpreting document, and it's not, the meaning of it is not fixed or set or yes, it does have multiple interpretations. But we've agreed we're going to carry out our conversation within its framework. And I'm quite alarmed actually at the number of voices who are saying, no, we actually don't want to do that anymore. Right. That's kind of what I mean by the illiberalism. I feel like you're going somewhere with this chain of questioning though.
So maybe, but I kind of liked that last answer. So maybe I don't need to go all the way there. Behind it is some questions about racism, which we're going to get to in just a second, because, when somebody like John Locke or Thomas Jefferson or James Madison or whatever talks about an ideal like everybody being created equal and that kind of universal inclusion, of course, they didn't have Native people or Black people in mind. And that creates some serious interpretive issues. But all that, and you talk about it extensively in the book. What your answer made me think of, though, is constitutional originalism, and I'm just curious what you think about it. I got the sense from the book that you don't think it's a very good way to approach the Constitution. Is that fair? Or would you describe yourself as an originalist?
No, I mean, I broached that subject very briefly in chapter 5. I'm not a lawyer, but I, as a, again, pre-2016 conservative, originalism is, I guess I'd call myself that. If I have to pick a school of jurisprudence, it's the nationalists are trying to advance what they're calling common good. Is it common good originalism or something like that? They have a word for what they're doing, and I think it's essentially right-wing progressivism. It's their way of trying to freely interpret the Constitution to mean what they want it to mean. And so I would oppose that. If I have to pick a school, I'd be originalist, but I admit that's not an issue I've thought a whole lot about.
Sure, that's fair. Okay, so let's talk about what was probably actually behind that previous question, and that is the various types of, I'm going to say that again because I hit the mic, the various types of Christian nationalism that there are. So you distinguish, I think this is in chapter 3, between a type of Christian nationalism you call cultural from a couple other types that you refer to as racial or ethnic, and I think the other one was theocratic. And you say that we can distinguish these conceptually, and we can kind of set the racist and theocratic versions aside because they're clearly not defensible, and focus in on maybe the most defensible form, which is cultural. And you admit that thereby you admit that Christian nationalism isn't inherently racist or theocratic, that there are versions of it that aren't that. And I put some quotes here where you make that point, but I think that's clear enough. So later in the book, though, and actually later in that same chapter, you say that you're kind of granting that distinction only for the sake of argument, and that in practice, really, the cultural forms of Christian nationalism do turn out to be, how do you put it here? Basically worse for minorities, religious and racial minorities, regardless of how much the cultural Christian nationalists want to say that they're not racist and theocratic. In practice, it often turns out that way. So I guess the question is, why admit the distinction from the beginning? And how do you, if you could just flesh out a little bit, how do you see the relationship between that more defensible cultural form and the other, what we would all agree are obviously indefensible racial and theocratic forms? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So it was a rhetorical choice. See, I'm constructing an argument that spans 10 chapters and 100 and whatever it is, 110,000 words. And I didn't want to smack the reader in chapter 1 with all the racial stuff and alienate a lot of people that I wanted to reach with the book. So I start the book by engaging with Christian nationalism on its terms. I give a whole chapter to them, and I say, here's the case for your ideology from your authors in the best way possible, and I'm going to take it at face value and argue with it. And I still disagree. I still think it's bad, right? But at least engage with that version of it. And over the course of those about 3 or 4 chapters, hopefully show you why, even in its best, strongest form, there are still some real problems with it. Then, if you're still with me, if you're still reading, and if I've persuaded you, now I'm going to peel back the curtain, and I'm going to show you maybe some of the reality that's there. Despite what the ideologues say on the page, some of the racial stuff really is there. And now maybe you have eyes to see it if you stuck with me this far in the book. So this is a piece of rhetoric. All books are. And I'm arranging the argument in a deliberate sequence to lead the reader along the path until perhaps they're ready to read what I have to say in chapter 7, 8, and 9.
Yeah. That's what I figured. And I think I'm just not the target audience of your book. I think you say at the beginning, if some progressives happen to pick this up and read it, hopefully you'll get some insight into what's going on here. But I think it was mostly aimed at conservatives. And I have conservative friends who would, I think, greatly benefit from that rhetorical style. And I highly recommend the chapters towards the end where you dive into that issue. And I think a very nuanced and honest way. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, in chapter 6, you go to great lengths to point out, and I think correctly in my opinion, that scripture verses like 2 Chronicles 7:14, which is, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray, seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear them from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. And then Psalm 33:12, another just beautiful verse that we love to hear politicians quote, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." And you go to great lengths to say these verses are not about America. And thank you for saying that. And thank you. I'm really appreciative of a conservative voice saying that. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I agree with that, but as a pastor, I can tell you that speaking that way from the pulpit makes all sorts of people very, very angry. And I can tell you also from experience that in particular, it makes conservative Christians, and by conservative, I mean Republicans, very angry. And the reality of why I have many pastor friends, I've been a pastor for a decade and a half, and the reality why most pastors won't say that and won't talk like that, even though you encourage us as pastors to make that argument and be very clear about it. And I think our world would be much better if we did. But the reason that they don't is because they'd probably lose 2/3 of their church, who are, the conservatives will leave. And bear in mind, I've lost progressives as well because I don't use certain dog whistle terms that they want to hear, and I refuse to do that, and then they'll leave. The extremes are on both sides are very similar, but the point is that that's a really hard thing to ask from pastors, to clarify this is not about America, this is about us as a people. When you say, and more often now in the last 4, 5, 6 years than ever before, have I been accused of being too political, or it's about the gospel, Randy, stop talking about politics. Whenever I talk about racial equality or justice or anything anything like that, it's stop talking about politics, stick to the gospel. What are your thoughts on that, and how would you recommend that pastors navigate that? How does your pastor navigate that? He's a part of the SBC. I can't imagine that would be a very popular stance for your pastor to take.
First of all, Randy, thank you so much for your work as a pastor. I know it's really, really hard, and especially the last few years, a lot of people have left the pastorate because of the challenges. COVID and politics is just really tough. So thanks for doing what you do, and please stick with it because we need shepherds.
Thank you.
Yeah, I end the book with a couple pages talking directly to pastors. It's a really tough issue. I understand that it can be tough to kind of find the right balance. I don't think the question is, should we talk about politics more or less? Right? There's not a dial here where you reach the right number 7, and like you get the right number, and then you're talking about politics the right amount. Mm-hmm. It's rather the way we talk about politics and the way we relate the Bible's truth to our political, social, and cultural lives. We shouldn't be. I don't think we should be single issue about politics. Your parishioners who complain it's just about the gospel, just preach the gospel. I bet they're probably not complaining whenever you say something pro-life from the pulpit or pro-religious liberty, right? There's a selectivity there in what people care about and what they classify as politics. So I don't think we should be partisan either, at least not yet at this moment. I don't think that we need people from the pulpit saying, vote this way. I think what I'm getting at is that when preachers preach God's truth, they take what God has said and given us, they unpack the meaning, they do the exegesis, and then they apply it to the life of the congregation. The application is to the individual and it's to the family, but then it keeps going. And I feel that many times sermons tend to stop at the individual, the family, and maybe the church, as if God's truth, as if the gospel only had implications at the individual level, maybe the family level and the church level, and that God's truth really has no relevance to anything else. Now, I think it does have relevance, and I think that I think the pastors have a role in helping us see that, how it's a natural extension of our lives as Christians to work out the implications, to work for flourishing in all areas of life. Now, I'm giving you a very abstract answer, and it may not be very satisfying, but here's another way of putting it. As a minister of the gospel, you represent Jesus. We all do as members of the church, right? We represent Jesus. We are his body. We are his voice. Right now, there's other people in the world claiming the name of Jesus for another agenda. And I think the church needs to be jealous of its prerogative to speak with Jesus's voice. And in a sense, you as a pastor have a special responsibility to jealously guard the name of Jesus. So if there's something else out there that you maybe discern is not truly reflective of the agenda of the kingdom of God, and yet is taking the name of Jesus, I think you need to speak out on that. Whatever format, blog, from the pulpit, Sunday school, in some format, speak out on it. And you're going to lose parishioners, but that may be the right cost to pay.
Yeah. And I mean, I will say, if you want to grow a church right now, particularly in, the heartland America or the South, just go hard nationalist, because those churches are growing leaps and bounds, and people are leaving churches where you hear what you're espousing for, Paul. But I think this is...
I'm not a church growth strategist.
No. And neither am I. And no pastor should be, I think. And this is where I think for pastors who are listening, there comes a point when our faithfulness and allegiance to Christ and the gospel is more important than our paycheck or bottom line or the butts in the seats at our church. So I think you're absolutely right, Paul. And I really appreciate hearing this from a conservative perspective.
Yeah. Let's just skip to your next one, I think.
Okay. So in chapter 7, you make the case that the Christian right, and I'm quoting you, is a partly nationalist movement. Let me say that again. You make the case in chapter 7 that the Christian right is a partly nationalist movement. You begin the chapter by quoting Pat Buchanan, who is a bastion of conservative politics, at the Republican National Convention in 1992, where he basically says that winning the religious war and the culture wars and protecting America's identity as God's country was the responsibility of the Republican Party. Would you agree with Kristen Dumais And I think your book is very similar to hers from a different perspective. But would you agree with Kristen that the religious right didn't accidentally come to support Donald Trump? The whole holding our noses thing was kind of a bunch of BS in many ways, but that the religious right was really built for and moving towards a strongman nationalist leader like Donald Trump all along.
Yes, I do want to add one qualification, but yes, I agree with that. That as I say, Donald Trump did not betray the values of the Christian right; he fulfilled them, and the value there is Christian power. And Donald Trump, that's a direct quote from his campaign in 2016. He said, "I will restore Christian power," and that was what a lot of the religious right was about. It was about gaining power for the Christian tribe to protect Christian interests, and in some cases, Christian values as well. And Kristen's book has, the same argument to it. Where the qualification I want to add is at the individual level. I'm commenting on the movement as a whole. I think was moving in this direction of desiring Christian power. I think it really was difficult for some individuals to cast that vote in 2016 and 2020. 2016, it was far more transactional. I want the justices. He's my only shot. Clinton's not going to give us the justices, and so I'll take it. I think the leaders who excused Trump's personal failings were far more cynical and explicit in just doing anything possible for the power. In 2020, I think the calculation is different. Then it was actually, hey, look, he did give us the justices, so let's reward him. Let's stick with him. He, ignore everything else. We got the justices. He seems to be our guy. And once again, the other side can't trust them, so we're going to go with him. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Senate candidate down in Georgia, that whole scandal about him paying for an abortion. You know what I'm talking about here?
Yes.
Herschel Walker. Somebody, was it Lauren Boebert, I think? She said, look, I don't care if he paid for somebody to abort baby eagles. I want the Senate. I want to take over the Senate. And I was kind of grateful that she's being honest. Like, thank you for saying it out loud, because we kind of knew that was the case all along for many of the leaders of the movement. It's just about winning power for the tribe, for the party. And the values don't actually matter all that much. Again, I think that's true of many of the leaders of the movement. I think at the individual level, many people felt torn, but their votes are still going to go there.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a follow-up question? And this you don't have to answer. And I genuinely mean that. Please tell me if you're uncomfortable with it. But you mentioned that you are part of a SBC church. The SBC as a denomination has, I would say, not every church and not every church leader, but many churches and many church leaders within the SBC have actually given wind and momentum to the nationalist movement within the Republican Party and espoused nationalist claims. And they've run people like Russell Moore out the door and villainized him. And I mean, he's got death threats from people in the SBC. How do you reconcile being part of an SBC church when that reality exists within the denomination itself?
Yeah. It would be different if I attended a very large, influential church. I don't. I go to a tiny neighborhood church around the corner from my house. And I'm comfortable there because it's just a community of mostly about half the church are older saints who've been there for half century. And my kids get a chance to serve them and love them. And without getting too much in the details of my particular church, we got a brand new pastor just a few months ago. Because that's the kind of church it is, I'm comfortable being there. I do have an eye on how the denomination nationally is moving. And that is a conversation that I occasionally broach with my pastors, with my elders.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I want to pose this and see if you agree with it. Maybe you don't. This is just a kind of sense I had or a feeling I had when I was reading particularly the central portions of your book where you're really critiquing Christian nationalism and, going through argument after argument and dealing with like very specific leading thinkers. And you're super charitable. More charitable than I would have been.
Extremely.
And you really carefully exegete these thinkers. And a lot of your critique, not all of it, but the gist of much of your critique of Christian nationalism in those chapters seemed to me to be some version of look around, and for listeners here, I'm gesturing widely, look around, the world is not that simple. And it seemed to me, maybe this is just because I'm a philosopher, but it seemed to me that very little actual argumentation is required to debunk the particular figures you were dealing with, even the more thoughtful nationalists that you very carefully read and cited. So if I'm right about that, maybe you don't think I am, but if I'm right about that, why do you think the view is so popular, including among people who seem like they should know better? And do you buy that most smart Christian nationalists are sincere? Because it's difficult for me to believe that they are when they make such bad arguments.
Yeah. It's a hard question because I don't like to impute motives. And so you're asking me sort of speculate about how other people think and feel about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just kind of share from my perspective. I think in my case, for me, my own international experience kind of played a role in this. Just because I have a career where I have worked with and traveled around and, been active internationally, it kind of helped me see some things about my country from the outside that you just said look really obvious. And to me, it looks pretty clear and pretty obvious too. But recognize that me and you, our backgrounds are kind of unique.
Yeah.
And that only a half of Americans have passports, for example. Only 40% have a college degree. And so for many Americans who still live in their hometown, they've been in their whole lives, and have went to their local public high school, been in that same church forever, the things that you and I are obvious to you and I, actually the opposite seems obvious to them. That's maybe my most charitable way of kind of constructing the way they think and why nationalism would appeal to them. But you've asked specifically about the leaders.
Yeah.
And I do have a harder time understanding the mindset there. I don't like imputing motives, and I don't like assuming cynical demagoguery, except about Trump. Like, I don't have a problem assuming that about him. Let's talk about Samuel Huntington. He's the...
Yeah, maybe I was just thinking maybe it's best to be specific.
And since he's the one who is, he is no longer on the scene, it's easiest to talk about him. I don't think that he was I think he believed what he was saying. Okay, I'll put it that way. And should he have known better? Yes, because he knows the data. The thing I really take issue with in Huntington's work is his contention that we have to be Anglo-Protestant to remain democratic, that these things are indissoluble. Well, he should know better, because it's very clear, the data is clear, that democracy is possible everywhere else in the world. So I think that for him, he allowed a kind of a nativist impulse to override his better judgment as a scholar. You can start to interpret data through the lens of your prejudices. Heaven knows I probably do it. And I think that maybe that have been the case with him in his last book. I think he's a good scholar. I've benefited from his other work, but he wrote one bad book.
Yeah. I appreciate your honesty there.
Yeah. You quote Roger Williams, a 17th century British minister and thinker,
founder of Rhode Island, right? That Roger Williams.
Yeah.
There you go. I had no idea.
Yeah. You said British minister. I was going to say, no, he's an American. We'll claim him.
There you go. Yeah. But Roger Williams said the Christian world would swallow up Christianity, and basically saying, you interpret him saying that he's warning that Christian culture could actually grow to become opposed to actual Christianity. And I think that's an extremely interesting perspective and explains a lot of what we see happening right now. Could you just elaborate on that perspective and reality?
It's sort of the political equivalent of Pharisaism, right? Pharisees who missed the point of the law by following it so exactly that they became self-righteous and judgmental. In the same way, our efforts to build political embodiments or reflections of Christianity, or build political versions of honoring Christianity, could actually violate the spirit of Christianity itself. If what we're doing ends up being discriminatory or bigoted or unjust or oppressive, the whole experiment of Christendom, 1,000 years of trying to build a universal Christian empire across Europe, was a bad idea, because it look, there's a few things they did better than the Romans, but by and large, it was discriminatory, and it was not a system of ordered liberty that allowed equal flourishing for all. And so it's much better, and indeed more Christian, to undo Christendom. And if you're actually working towards equal flourishing for all, that's a more Christian thing than to build Christendom.
Yeah, Williams is an extremely interesting character for current Christians to look at. I think he was notorious in his day for doing a lot of things that made a whole lot of Christians and a whole lot of nationalists, frankly, really uncomfortable. He formed very close relationships with the Native Americans, held very weird theological opinions that alienated everybody, but insisted on continuing the dialogue with everybody. And that was kind of his version of being politically civil. There's a really interesting book called Mere Civility by Teresa Bejan that profiles him and a couple other people, if anybody's interested more in Roger Williams.
I had a much longer section in the book about Williams and his dialogue with John Cotton. Had to be cut for length, but he is a fascinating character. And I so appreciate his theological contribution to the doctrine of religious liberty and disestablishment.
Yeah.
I think many American Christians think that religious liberty is a constitutional doctrine, and they're ready to kind of renegotiate the boundaries there. And I want to remind everybody, it's actually a biblical doctrine. The Bible says that government, that state and church have separate jurisdictions. Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. And he does not give authority to the state to enforce right worship of himself. So we need to, as Christians, honor the biblical doctrine of disestablishment.
Yeah. And also Rhode Island is beautiful. So.
That's right.
There you go. We're winding up here, Paul, but in the book, you say something that's fascinating and it makes sense, but I've never thought about it. You say, and I'm quoting you here, something about white American Christianity itself makes whites' racial attitudes worse, not better. That's incredible. And then you say that there's something about the intersection of whiteness and Christianity that makes a person more racist in America. Can you just explain that? That's data-based, and you kind of flesh that out in the book. Can you flesh it out for our listeners and tell us about this incredible intersection of whiteness and American Christianity that makes a person perhaps more racist?
It looks like we're out of time.
I promise the next two questions are softballs.
Yeah, so this is one of the harder questions, and I feel like I need to write an article. Just is Christian nationalism racist? It's kind of address it head on. The particular part you're quoting from there, I'm drawing heavily on data from pollsters and sociologists and others who have polled Christians and found their attitudes towards nationalism and towards race and other things, and they found this interesting thing that white Christians think about race one way that is different from non-white Christians and also different from white non-Christians. And so there's an interactive effect of being white and being Christian that generates a certain worldview that collectively seems to overlook the realities of what people call systemic racism, what I might call inherited intergenerational inequality, right? White Christianity, or being white and being Christian together, comes with a worldview, and that worldview emphasizes individualism. It emphasizes what does Michael Emerson say? Free will individualism, individual accountability, and things like that, which make us not see the reality of inherited racial inequalities across the generations, and that makes those who grew up in this culture, I would say charitably, less racially sensitive than others, than white non-Christians and than non-white Christians. And that's a legacy that we should grapple with because it's a reality in the data that I think many white Christians have not recognized yet. And it should cause us to pause and to reflect soberly.
I would love it if you wrote more about that, because that is something that, like, I would love it if you were just on tour and could go to church after church after church and talk about that, because pastors won't talk about it by and large, because again, it gets us into trouble. We lose people because of it. But a voice like yours would be so important to highlight that reality and to let Christians come face to face with that sobering statistic. And again, it's just data. It's not opinion. So please go on tour and to churches and talk about this.
Thank you. Honestly, I think some of the other scholars are better because they have a better grasp on the data. But the bottom line is that our religious identities are being shaped by our racial, ethnic, and cultural identities rather than the other way around. Mm-hmm. Right? If we're being faithful Christians, our Christianity should be the thing that shapes all the rest of our lives, including our racial, ethnic, and cultural identities. But the data pretty clearly shows the relationship is backwards, and that should be a shame to us. We should be Christians first and members of an ethnic or cultural group second.
There's a soundbite for you.
Yeah, yeah. We always look for little sound bites we can pick out and put on social media. You just gave us one. Okay, I promised softball questions. Here you go. So you mentioned Hamilton, the play, not the political figure,
The musical.
the musical, several times in the book. And you seem to be a fan. If I misread that, correct me. But you seem to be a fan. So if you are a fan, could you tell us what you like about it and how it fits into your critique of nationalism? But also, you seem to think it's like a good model of what modern racially informed patriotism could look like. So yeah, just talk a little bit about Hamilton.
With much reverence, please, Paul.
Because we're both fans.
I am nowhere near as big of a fan as my wife, who listened to the soundtrack on repeat for years on end and has the whole thing memorized. And we actually finally had a chance to go see a live performance at the Kennedy Center just a couple months ago.
Wow.
So I enjoy it. It's quite a lot. I love it. You know, I bring Hamilton up in when I'm talking about Richard Lowry's book on nationalism and jazz. Okay. So Lowry's got this thing where he says American culture is not intrinsically white because there's all these cultural influences. And I think Lowry is right about that. But then later on, Lowry says to be a nationalist is to want to preserve the cultural nation. And I kind of like scratch my head. Which one do you want? Do you want the cultural fluidity and change and assimilation and mixing that gives you jazz? Or do you want to just have one fixed culture for all time that you're going to preserve as a nationalist? You can't have it both ways. I think Hamilton is like jazz, is a perfect example of taking the best of America from all cultural streams, putting it in a blender, mixing it up, and look what comes out. You know, what would life be like without jazz? What would America be like without Hamilton? We would be lesser. It would be an impoverished life. We are richer for having the intermingling, the mixing, the change of multiple cultural streams that give us these wonderful cultural creations.
Yeah, I love that. When you were talking about jazz, I thought, man, that goes for so many other cultural products.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
yeah,
have been
absolutely.
assimilated by white Americans. I mean, we would never have had hip hop if that kind of nationalism had held sway. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, and I hope
I got one more question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No,
you want to go first?
You go first.
Okay. So the last thing, and I hope this doesn't get you into any trouble or too contentious, but my favorite line in the book, I literally laughed out loud. This is on page 142. You say, nationalism, this is a chapter closer, so you knew what you were doing. It was a zinger. You say, nationalism is little more than political onanism and about as fruitful. Maybe some of our listeners don't know what onanism is.
Or maybe a co-host.
Or maybe a co-host. Those people should Google it. So there's a famous character in the Old Testament. Well, I don't know how famous he is, but a character in the Old Testament, maybe the only time masturbation is mentioned in the Bible, who gets in trouble with God for not inseminating the woman he was supposed to inseminate and instead spilling his seed upon the ground.
Yeah, not the first time that Onan has been referenced on this podcast.
Believe it or not the first time. So basically you're comparing Christian nationalism to masturbation. And I just laughed out loud, and I wanted to thank you for putting that in there. And I hope it hasn't gotten you into too much trouble.
Thank you for highlighting that passage. I got beat up on Twitter just the other day because people thought it was a little bit cheap and vulgar. The thing is, I'm actually kind of making a serious point. Like I'm trying to highlight that nationalism is self-oriented rather than other-oriented. I'm trying to highlight that it is fruitless, right? Political order is supposed to bear the fruit of peace, justice, and order, and I think nationalism doesn't do that. And I'm highlighting that I'm drawing on the biblical analogy between idolatry and adultery. Right? Regularly, you see that equation in the Bible, and if nationalism can become idolatrous, it does become a form of adultery with oneself. And so I thought the metaphor was apt, and it was a way of capping off my 3-chapter long critique of nationalism. So I'm glad you enjoyed the zinger, but I did have a serious point to it.
Yeah, it's good. So Paul, you're a veteran. You worked for the CIA. Kyle mentioned you worked in George W. Bush's administration. You are a professor at Georgetown University. There is no one more qualified, very few people more qualified to answer this question. And this is something that I texted Kyle and Elliot, our producer, just last week. We live in Wisconsin, so that means that Ron Johnson is one of the candidates running for Senate. He is our current senator. Ron Johnson actively espoused conspiracy theories about COVID-19 and unscientific things. He overlooks January 6th in the attempted coup at the Capitol. He is destructive in all sorts of ways, and it's just that he's this microcosm of what's going on in the nation, I feel like. And my question for you, Paul, is, and I mean this, and I would like to hear your answer, is what the hell has happened to Republicans and to the Republican Party? That's what I want to say. What the hell has happened to the Republican Party?
Once again, we're out of time, aren't we? So I want to make a distinction between like the Republican voters, Republican Party, and then Biden called them the MAGA Republicans. He tried to distinguish between all Republicans and the kind of the part that seems to have gone truly crazy, right? With conspiracy theories and lies about the election and lies about COVID. What has happened? I wrote a piece for the Dispatch where I wondered out loud if the Republican Party is becoming the Sinn Féin of American politics. Some listeners might understand the analogy. Sinn Féin was a political party that ran cover for the IRA terrorist movement. And they had this weird relationship where Sinn Féin would participate in politics peacefully, but they would be the mouthpiece for an extremist movement. And I wonder if there's an extremist movement. Thank God it's not a terrorist group, although there is incidents of political violence. And then there's the broad political party with peaceful people and people in office and people doing the normal things. And there's this relationship between the party and the extremist movement. And it's deeply troubling. Not all Republicans fall in that extremist category, but it's true to say that the extremists are essentially taking over or have taken over. Donald Trump's the head of the party. And if you look at the results of the primary elections across the country in 2022, the extremist elements are the ones who won many of the primaries. Now, we're recording this in late October. Just a few weeks from now, we're going to have the midterm elections, and I'm going to be looking very carefully to see which of those actually get elected in the general election. My hope and prayer is that those extremists lose, and that will be a come to Jesus moment for the Republican Party institutionally. And just for the sake of their own survival and strategic interest, they'll stop nominating the crazies and will return to something like a normal conservatism.
Yep. So last question then. Let's just give you a crystal ball and ask you, what do you think the Republican Party looks like, or what do you think American politics looks like in 10, 15 years?
Yeah, it's impossible to answer that, in part because victories and defeats really matter. And who wins and who loses in 2 weeks and in 2 years change the trajectory. We would not be in the moment we are in if Donald Trump had lost in 2016, right? So it was a bit of a fluke, a statistical fluke that he pulled out that victory. But now we have all this stuff because victory has 1,000 fathers. Once he won, everyone piles on and says, yeah, I'm going to be this. I'm going to do the nationalist thing and create this magazine and found a new movement and have a conference, the National We wouldn't have a National Conservatism Conference without his victory. So once people win, people flock to that like a soccer ball. So I don't know who's going to win and who's going to lose, but it does mean we each of us have some agency here. I don't know what America looks like in 15 years, but I do know that you and I and all the listeners will cast ballots and we will donate to candidates and we will canvass for them. And that will make a difference in what kind of America we live in 15 years. So if you want the kind of country without a crazy extremist element in charge of one of the two political parties, you got to say so. Speak up and say so, even if it offends your fellow parishioners. You got to say something. I'm sorry, I'm not talking just to you two guys. I'm talking to all listeners. Yeah, but we have agency here and we have responsibility.
It's very good. Well, the book is The Religion of American Greatness: What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism. Dr. Paul Miller, we're so grateful that you wrote this book and grateful for your voice. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on the show. I really enjoyed this, and I'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, same. Maybe when that second book about progressivism is out, we'll really have it out.
There you go.
Nice.
Thanks.